this hour to China. They have held a massive...
So the parade is over here and we are seeing...
China and Russia are preparing something that will destroy Trump forever. While Trump was signing his decrees one after another in the Oval Office this week, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin spent 47 minutes on the phone discussing what they politely call deepening the strategic partnership. Translation: they're building the largest anti-American coalition since the Cold War, and Trump has absolutely no idea what's coming for him. Because here's the truth that nobody in Washington wants to admit. While the American president is fighting with CNN and reversing Obama's decisions, Beijing and Moscow are busy rewriting the world order, and this time, they have a plan that will do far more than simply embarrass America. They want to demolish Trump's legacy before it's even written. And the most terrifying part of all this? They're already halfway there. Let's first understand the scale of what's brewing. China and Russia aren't simply trading partners exchanging natural gas for smartphones. They've created what Pentagon analysts privately call the authoritarian axis of the 21st century, an economic, military, and diplomatic bloc designed specifically to counter every lever of American power. Sino-Russian bilateral trade surpassed $240 billion in 2024, exploding all previous records despite, or rather because of, Western sanctions. But the numbers tell only a fraction of the story. What's really happening is strategic integration at every level that makes the Soviet-Chinese alliance of the 1950s look like a suburban book club. Joint military exercises in the South China Sea, in the Arctic, in the Eastern Mediterranean, they're testing their interoperability like they're preparing for the main event. Russian strategic bombers patrol with Chinese fighters off the coast of Japan and South Korea, while their navies practice blockading Taiwan together. Last September, they conducted their largest joint naval exercise in history with over 10,000 troops involved, explicitly simulating a conflict with the United States and its allies. This isn't geopolitical theater to impress the media. This is a dress rehearsal, and while Trump tweets about tariffs and promises to make America great again, Beijing and Moscow are methodically building the military, economic, and diplomatic infrastructure that will make that promise obsolete. They're not just talking, they're acting. While Washington is paralyzed by sterile partisan wars and Congress can't even agree on a budget without threatening to shut down the government every 6 months, Putin and Xi are deploying a coordinated strategy across every continent with a discipline that America hasn't known since the Cold War. The diabolical genius of their strategy is that they've understood something Trump stubbornly refuses to accept. You don't destroy the American superpower by confronting it directly. You gradually make it irrelevant. Take the financial system. While Washington focuses on the debt ceiling and tweets about the Fed, China and Russia have spent the last 7 years patiently building alternatives to the SWIFT system, de-dollarizing their trade, and convincing dozens of countries to join their cross-border payment system. The yuan now represents over 20% of China's international transactions versus practically zero a decade ago. Russia has reduced its dollar reserves by 90% since 2018 and has built its own payment system, SPFS, which now connects over 400 financial institutions across 23 countries. Saudi Arabia, Washington's historic ally since 1945, is seriously discussing accepting yuan for its oil exports and has even considered joining BRICS. The United Arab Emirates is doing the same. India, despite its territorial tensions with China, trades massively in rupees and yuan to bypass the dollar. Brazil and Argentina have announced their intention to create a South American common currency. When the petrodollar collapses, America's entire ability to finance its $1.7 trillion deficit and project its power evaporates. Since 1971, the United States has had the exorbitant privilege of printing the world's reserve currency, allowing it to spend without limits and impose sanctions that can destroy entire economies with the stroke of a pen. This financial monopoly has been the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal, far more effective than all the aircraft carriers and cruise missiles combined. And Beijing and Moscow are systematically dismantling it, country by country, transaction by transaction. Trump can agitate all he wants on the world stage, but if nobody needs American dollars to trade, his negotiating power disappears like snow in the sun. Every time he threatens to impose sanctions, he actually accelerates the de-dollarization process because he reminds the entire world why it's dangerous to depend on a currency controlled by Washington. This is involuntary sabotage on a geopolitical scale, and Beijing and Moscow know it perfectly. They're playing the long game while Trump plays speed chess, and frankly, they must be pinching themselves. Now let's talk about what should really terrify every strategist in Washington: the Sino-Russian technological alliance that's consolidating while America tears itself apart over TikTok and ChatGPT. Russia brings its military-grade cybersecurity capabilities developed after 2 decades of information warfare, its space technologies inherited from the Soviet program, and its absolute mastery of hybrid warfare and disinformation. China brings its growing lead in artificial intelligence with more patents filed in this field than the United States since 2019. Its near-total dominance over rare earths, representing 70% of global production and 90% of refining, and its industrial production capacity, without equivalent in human history, that allows it to manufacture more steel in 1 month than America in a year. Together, they're creating a technological ecosystem completely separate from Silicon Valley and its European satellites. You think semiconductor sanctions are going to slow down China? Beijing has invested over $150 billion in its chip industry since 2020, with discreet but crucial technical assistance from Moscow, sharing its own research developed under embargo since the 1990s. SMIC, China's semiconductor champion, now produces 7-nanometer chips despite all American restrictions and pressure on ASML not to sell its EUV machines to China. Huawei released its Mate 60 Pro with a domestically manufactured Kirin 9000S processor that completely shocked Western experts who thought it was technologically impossible under sanctions. It's not yet at the level of TSMC or Intel, but remember that China controls not only rare earths, but also Congolese cobalt refining, Chilean lithium processing, and the majority of the battery supply chain. When they decide to tighten the screws, and they will at the optimal moment to maximize Trump's humiliation, the entire American tech industry will suffocate. Imagine Apple unable to produce iPhones because China blocks the export of neodymium and dysprosium needed for magnets and speakers. Tesla without batteries because KATL and BYD refuse to deliver. The Pentagon without materials for its Javelin, guided missiles and precision targeting systems that all depend on Chinese rare earths. This isn't dystopian science fiction. This is the concrete geopolitical reality that Beijing and Moscow are setting up piece by piece, while Trump brags about having intimidated a few CEOs at dinners at Mar-a-Lago and thinks that banning Huawei from American 5G networks constitutes a strategic victory. The real economic war hasn't even started yet, and America is already losing it because its president thinks imposing 25% tariffs on Mexican imports and threatening the European Union on Twitter constitutes a coherent geopolitical strategy. It's like trying to win a 21st century war with 1980s trade tactics, and the gap between the sophistication of the Sino-Russian approach and the simplistic brutality of Trump's approach becomes more embarrassing every day. Now here's where it gets really vicious, and this is where you understand why the title of this analysis isn't sensationalist hyperbole, but a sober assessment of current geopolitical dynamics. China and Russia don't simply want to weaken America or win a trade war. They want to personally destroy Trump by demonstrating to the entire world that the era of American dominance is over, and that it ended precisely during his presidency because of his incompetence, his narcissism, and his infantile understanding of international relations. This is geopolitical judo of the highest order, and it's absolutely brilliant in its calculated cruelty. Think about it for a second. Trump has built his entire political brand on the image of the ruthless negotiator who wrote The Art of the Deal, the businessman who bends adversaries to his will through force of personality, the president who makes America respected again after the supposed humiliations of the Obama era. Every foreign policy decision he makes is filtered through this narcissistic prism of publicly winning, humiliating his adversaries, demonstrating his personal superiority. He doesn't see international relations as a complex system of interdependent alliances and delicate power balances. He sees everything as a Manhattan real estate transaction where the strongest and most aggressive wins. Beijing and Moscow have studied this psychology for 8 years now, since his first campaign in 2016, and they've built their entire strategy around an intimate understanding of his psychological weaknesses and cognitive blind spots. They know exactly how to manipulate his ego, how to flatter him so he lowers his guard, how to give him small symbolic victories that cost nothing but convince him he's winning. They're going to let him strut in front of the cameras, tweet his victories against China and Russia, impose his tariffs that hurt the American economy more than theirs, withdraw America from a few more international agreements that actually weaken America's strategic position while giving him the impression he's kept his promises to his base. They'll even sometimes pretend to yield on minor points, buy a few billion in American soybeans, release a few prisoners, make a few symbolic gestures, to feed his ego and convince him he's the greatest negotiator in history. And then, at the perfectly calibrated moment, probably in the next 18 to 24 months, when the 2028 campaign starts looming and Trump wants to demonstrate his strength to ensure his succession or that of his political heir, they're going to simultaneously activate all the levers of power they've patiently set up for years. A manufactured crisis around Taiwan that exposes America's inability to defend its allies when China blockades the island and America realizes it can't win a conventional war 8,000 miles from its shores against a power that considers Taiwan an existential stake. A massive restructuring of global trade routes that completely bypasses American ports via the new Silk Roads, the Arctic corridors Russia is developing with nuclear icebreakers, and the new deepwater ports China is building in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Djibouti, and throughout Africa. A coordinated sale of U.S. Treasury bonds that explodes interest rates, plunges the American economy into recession, and reveals the fundamental vulnerability of a country that must borrow $1 trillion a year to function. A devastating cyber attack on American critical infrastructure, power grids, water distribution systems, air traffic control, banking systems that paralyzes the country for days and reveals that Trump's Space Force and all his traditional defense investments have done strictly nothing to prepare America for 21st century warfare waged in cyberspace and the information realm. And while all this simultaneously collapses, while Americans queue for gas and Wall Street panics, they'll make sure that every international media outlet, every foreign capital, every international forum understands the message hammered relentlessly. This happened because America elected a narcissistic charlatan who confused geopolitical negotiations with Manhattan real estate deals, who destroyed alliances patiently built over 70 years, who turned America into an international pariah with his whims and insulting tweets. They don't just want to beat America in an abstract geopolitical conflict, they want the defeat to be so humiliating, so catastrophic, so personally and publicly associated with Trump and his chaotic governing style that his name becomes synonymous with American decline for the next 100 years in history books. They want Trump to become a verb meaning to destroy one's own country's strategic position through narcissistic incompetence. They want future American presidents to spend decades trying to repair the damage from his time in power. This is total and absolute legacy destruction, and it's being executed with a patience and sophistication that Washington can't even conceive in its current state of political dysfunction. And you know what's really tragic in all this? Nobody around Trump dares tell him the truth, because his entire cabinet is populated with sycophants, ideological loyalists, and opportunists whose main professional qualification is never contradicting the boss even when he proposes something manifestly insane. The real foreign policy experts, the people who understand China and Russia at a deep level, who speak Mandarin and Russian fluently, who've spent decades studying these cultures and political systems, who have networks of contacts in the ministries and universities of these countries, they've all been methodically purged after 2016 or left on their own because they couldn't stand the ambient incompetence and total contempt for expertise that characterizes the Trump administration. Instead, Trump surrounds himself with people like Peter Navarro, who think all of geopolitics boils down to PowerPoint graphs about bilateral trade deficits and who sincerely believe China will collapse if America stops importing televisions, or ideological neophytes who've never set foot in Asia but are convinced that Chinese authoritarianism will spontaneously collapse if we simply stop buying their products because free markets always triumph. This is magical thinking elevated to the rank of national doctrine, and it's absolutely terrifying when you realize these people are making decisions affecting hundreds of millions of lives. Meanwhile, in the situation rooms at Zhongnanhai and the Kremlin, brilliant strategists who've studied Sun Tzu and Clausewitz since childhood, who understand American history better than most Americans, who can anticipate American domestic political reactions with frightening precision, are developing 40-dimensional plans that anticipate every likely American move 3 years in advance with conditional branches for every contingency. This isn't even a fair fight at this point. It's like watching a FIDE-certified chess grandmaster play against someone who discovered the rules yesterday and thinks moving their queen aggressively every turn and threatening the opposing king on the third move constitutes a winning strategy. Except in this game, the stakes aren't a plastic trophy in a high school gym, but the future of world order for the rest of the 21st century, and America is being demolished, move after move without even realizing it's already lost its queen, both rooks, both knights, and half its pawns in the first 15 moves. When Trump finally understands what's happening to him, it'll already be over and irreversible. The decline will be locked in. And the most beautiful part of all this, from Beijing and Moscow's cynical perspective, is that Trump himself will have actively facilitated every step of his own destruction by methodically alienating America's traditional allies with his demands for payment for protection and his public insults against Merkel, Macron, Trudeau, and all democratic leaders who dare contradict him, by destroying multilateral institutions like the WTO and WHO that could have contained China's rise, by transforming NATO into a mafia protection racket where you have to pay a percentage of GDP to deserve American defense, and by convincing half the world that America is no longer a reliable partner you can count on, but an unpredictable racketeer led by a megalomaniac who can tear up any agreement as soon as the political wind turns. Xi and Putin didn't even have to do much to weaken America. They just had to patiently wait for Trump to methodically sabotage the American strategic position built since 1945, while occasionally sending him a few calculated flatteries to keep him on this self-destructive path and ensure he never realizes what he's doing. This is pure strategic genius. It's geopolitical Aikido, where you use your opponent's strength against himself. And it's absolutely terrifying if you truly understand what's at stake and you have even a minimum attachment to the idea of a liberal world order based on rules rather than on the law of the strongest. So here's where we are right now, late January 2026. Trump is back in power for what could be a full second term, convinced in his pathological narcissism that he's restoring American greatness with his executive orders that he signs smiling in front of cameras and his trade threats that he throws out on Truth Social at 3 in the morning. Meanwhile, literally as I'm speaking to you, China and Russia have spent recent years patiently, methodically, without media noise, building the complete architecture of a post-American world order. New payment systems that bypass SWIFT and the dollar, new military alliances that exclude NATO, new trade routes that avoid American ports, new technological standards that make American products incompatible, new international institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that rival the World Bank and IMF. They've transformed BRICS from a Goldman Sachs acronym and a discussion club without real power into a genuine economic alliance with its own development bank, now lending tens of billions annually, its own reserve currency in active preparation, and 35 countries lining up to join because they're tired of American hegemony. They've convinced the majority of the global South that the future belongs to those who trade with Beijing and Moscow and not with Washington, which imposes humiliating conditions and overthrows governments when it feels like it. They've demonstrated through their actions in Ukraine, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and elsewhere that they can do absolutely whatever they want inside their spheres of influence without real significant consequences, because Trump's America is too distracted by its culture wars, too divided by its internal polarization, too tired after 20 years of failed wars in the Middle East to actually stop them. And now, right at this moment, they're preparing for the coup de grace, the carefully choreographed moment when they'll simultaneously activate all their levers of economic, military, technological, and diplomatic power to demonstrate once and for all that the American century is well and truly over, and that it ended with Trump watching confusedly from his golf club in Bedminster while the world burned around him and he tweeted that everything was fine and he was winning. Future historians will identify these years, this exact period, as the historic tipping point where American hegemony collapsed irreversibly, not because of a devastating war or a natural disaster or an economic collapse, but simply because Americans were stupid enough, blinded enough by partisan polarization, to elect twice a man whose only real qualification was playing a successful businessman on a reality TV show for 14 years. Beijing and Moscow literally can't believe their luck. They were preparing for a long generational struggle against a competent America led by serious professionals. Instead, they got Trump, the best influence agent they could ever have dreamed of recruiting, and he was working for free, out of pure narcissism, without even realizing he was serving their interests. In 10 or 15 years, when your children ask you how exactly America lost its status as an unchallenged superpower, you'll have to explain to them that a narcissistic real estate developer from Queens who went bankrupt 6 times managed to do what the Soviet Union with its 40,000 nuclear warheads, Maoist China with its billion inhabitants, and all the world's terrorist movements with their attacks had never been able to accomplish. Destroy American credibility and legitimacy completely from the inside, without a single shot being fired. And the worst part, what makes this entire tragedy even more bitter? He sincerely thought he was winning the whole time. He'll probably die thinking he was the greatest American president in history. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will toast to his health with their best champagne when it's all finally over, because Donald Trump will objectively have been the greatest strategic gift they ever received, the unpredictable X factor that accelerated American decline by 50 years. The irony is so perfect, so cosmically appropriate, that it becomes almost poetic. Almost.